Okay, Stacey, this one is definitely for you. Do you feel that a consultant is needed for strategic planning?
I'm going to give that lovely answer of it depends. I so bottom line, no. I think it can be helpful if you have a good one. So I think that if, oftentimes organizations don't have the budget to hire one, right? And we know strategic planning consulting can be costly. So I think that that's where oftentimes people are like, do I really need a consultant? And those are the times when I say, well, like first you need to define like what does strategic planning mean for your organization? Can it be strategic planning light where maybe a consultant wouldn't be needed because you really just want to have a discussion or a handful of discussions over a few, months or, a month or whatever that looks like to just talk about your future and where you're going and setting goals. And so absolutely you can do that yourself. And I think the key with it that is challenging if you're like leaning on existing staff is we know staff at nonprofits wear multiple hats already. And now you're going to add this to their plate. And what truly does the end product or look like? Because if you're thinking about strategic planning in its purest, truest form, you're doing everything. I mean, it's a longer process. It's not just like a half day. It's about like we're going to do some analysis and we're going to look at what's going on in trending with others in the marketplace and where we're seeing maybe others with mission overlap. We're going to do some stakeholder interviews with people both inside and outside our organization to try to gather that. I mean, all of that takes time, and oftentimes there is bias inherent. You want to hear a certain thing, right? And so that's where you can jeopardize the data you're gathering if you don't have someone who can truly be like an impartial, biased, provide that kind of perspective. And I just so I think it's hard. I also think facilitation can be hard if you want your own voice to be heard, right? Like it is hard to facilitate and be an active like contributor and to manage to do that dance is tough. So sometimes having that person, that outside party to help you like do that so you can actually be a fully engaged and then to document it and organize it in a document that actually you can use. So like all that is a whole lot of time. And I find most organizations can't do it like with their staff. I mean, one workaround, and I don't see this happen often, but I have seen it done where organizations might bring in, maybe they have someone that their board knows or someone in the community that's a friend of their organization that is good at like their role in their day job, their professional job is some kind of strategic thinking, planning type role. Like sometimes you can get people like that will volunteer, like this is kind of their side project or they want to help. Like they do one, I've seen large strategic planning firms, like the big ones like McKinsey and Company or things like that, where they actually will sometimes like have so many community projects, like pro bono projects they do a year or at a really reduced rate. So there are ways, I think, if truly like money is the issue, you could look at other things, other ways to kind of check, like get that skill set. You could also like thinking about board recruitment. If strategic planning and thinking is something really important for that lens, like you could have that be one of the things you're looking for as you're trying to recruit board members and see if that board member would be willing to kind of wear that hat for you. I mean, that they wouldn't be able to be quite as active of a participant. So that would be the downside. But if they knew the process and were willing to kind of like lead it for your organization, that would be another idea. So I think that, full circle, those are few options I like to share. And I think there's absolutely value with the right consultant. And it's like being so clear though about what strategic planning is like and what that means for your organization. Andy, I don't know about you, but so many times like people throw around this word strategic planning. And when I actually kind of peel back the layers, they're not actually talking about a true strategic plan at all. Like they're talking about we need to set some goals for the 1 year ahead and and figure out how we're going to do it. And that, no, you probably don't need consultant, the full on, paid consultant for that.
Yeah, I've seen it done both ways, right? So I've been part of organizations where we handled it internally, and then part of organizations where we brought in an external consultant. I always felt like if if the board is going to be involved, it almost has to be somebody external because there's too much of a weird relationship between board and staff to have a staff member facilitating a strategic plan that includes board feedback. It's there's too much of a conflict of interest and it's too confusing. And the board members are going to be weird. They're going to not give you they're not going to give you true answers necessarily because the staff members in the room. And then to your other point, if you're going to do it internally, it needs to be someone's actual job. It can't just be something that you
Right.
periodically assign to someone because they've got good handwriting. It
Yeah.
has to be their actual job and they need to know how to do it and have been trained to do it or have done it before. And then you're going to get something good out of it. Because if you just kind of throw it at that, you don't look busy and you've got nice handwriting. Let's go.
Yeah.
You're not going to come up with something that's going to be really very good. And again, like you said, everybody's so busy. Just to add an additional responsibility on somebody that's already super busy is you're not going to be happy with what the outcome is. So yeah, but I have seen it done in reasonably sized organizations from an internal position, as long as it wasn't a board information strategic plan. If it was totally staff driven and then it was presented to the board as this is our new strategic plan, do you have comments? It worked that direction. But if you're starting with the board, I would find that very, very difficult.
Yeah. I think that, I mean, the other thing that I think about with this is just how many people say it's with any consultant, like vet, right? Like make sure your scope is clear and vet properly and find out like exactly what it looks like, because there's times where I've seen consulting products that it was not aligned at all with what the organization needed or wanted. And so that really goes back. I mean, that's part consultant fault, but part organization fault for not getting really clear on like what is this used for? What is it that we're actually trying to find out? Like, what are we trying to do? And I took that for granted. I took that for granted when I started doing that kind of work because I would just assume strategic planning meant the same thing for everybody. And I quickly learned that that was not it at all. So, so I now say when someone says, hey, can you come in and do a, you know, 3-hour strategic planning retreat? I'm like, no. I can start the conversation. That's not going to give you a strategic plan in 3 hours if you really want to do
Right.
this the right way.
Nonprofit governance.
Nonprofit answers.
Nonprofit board.
Nonprofit management.
Nonprofit marketing.
Nonprofit resources.
Welcome to Nonprofit Everything, the podcast where hosts Andy Shurick and Stacey Wedding answer your questions about all things nonprofit.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Nonprofit Everything. So glad to be here with you today. I am joined with my fantastic, fabulous co-host, Andy Shurick, and I am Stacey Wedding, and we appreciate you listening. So you're in for another great episode. And as you've noticed, probably, we don't actually have like paid ads. Partly because we don't have the bandwidth to go after them, but partly because we know that most people find ads on podcasts kind of annoying. So we've sort of like said, hey, we're going to give you a break and just give you us. But with that, I thought this would be kind of fun. I'm borrowing it or stealing it from another podcast that I listen to, the Table Group. And they occasionally do these things like unpaid advertisements, and they just pick random things that they think are cool or that they would promote just so people know about them. So I'm going to just take the liberties and share one with you this time. I'm going to do an unpaid advertisement for something called Akimbo, Akimbo. And Akimbo is kind of a brainchild of anyone who's followed like the author and marketing extraordinaire Seth Godin. He actually kind of created this, and it's like a B Corp. And years ago, he launched it and went off. But it's this like online learning and engagement platform, unlike any other I've experienced. Like, so if I'm going to do online learning, It is the most like there's people from around the world that join in. You get to share, and part of the like sort of agreement being a part of it is not only like you get to like react, respond to certain questions, prompts, or lessons that are taught, but you also have to like do some exercises tied to it, like your homework, and other people, at least like so many other people, have to respond to your what you said and give you like say, hey, that's a cool way to think about it. Did you think about this? Or did you do this? It's just a really organic, most engaging online experience I've had for learning and kind of leveling up. And I've done a lot of their workshops, and I just did one in June that was their first. They were piloting one called Summer Camp for Adults, basically. And it's super cool. So that's a story for another day. I'm going to actually do a blog post about it in August. But that's my unpaid advertisement, Akimbo's. So go check them out if you haven't heard of them. And if you like to kind of learn like I do, if you're a lifelong learner, I think you'll enjoy it. And again, thank you for listening. And as you tune into this episode, be thinking about questions that arise for you, right? Like we always need your questions, and you can send those to us. By finding Andy and I on email, going to nonprofiteverything.com, finding, at Nonprofit Everything on the social channels and all that jazz. So we love your questions. Keep them coming. Andy time. How does that feel, Andy? Someone wrote this question and said, Andy time.
It's going to be a nerd question, I can tell.
No, I feel a little rejected by this, but when I looked at the question, I will say I would be mortified if someone asked it of me. So, all right, here we go. Here's a question. When calculating liquidity, should an organization look at total cash on hand divided by the average monthly expenses, or something more nuanced like total cash plus cash equivalent divided by the average monthly expenses? What about excluding revenue with donor restrictions and unrestricted property and equipment, less loan, mortgage?
I love this question. This question goes deep fast, right?
Yeah.
It's not like I have a question about this. It's like, here's some very technical detail and I would like you to solve it for me. So I'm going to rewind all the way back to the beginning, because like the first, not counting Andy time, the first three words of this question have a lot buried in them. It says, when calculating liquidity, right? So if you've heard me, I do presentations pretty frequently on nonprofit cash flow. That's like one of my horses that I like to beat, dead horses that I like to beat, is talking about, in general, like the way financial statements are presented, the way we talk about nonprofits in board meetings, in the financial side of it, is just, we've just 100% got the wrong end of the stick. So, the balance sheet, the income statement, the cash flow statement that literally no one can read, like maybe two people on your board can maybe kind of read it. Like all these things we present, and then we talk about them, and the board tries to ask intelligent questions about them. And then we like kind of move on. We're just like, okay, thanks for that report. Moving on. Because it doesn't actually answer any of the questions that are important to a nonprofit. And what's important to a nonprofit? And I came up with an analogy that I used at a presentation back in, I think it was like March, of like a water wheel. So what a regular for-profit business is trying to do is they're trying to like take a river and put a dam in it, and then fill up that lake so that they basically stopped the flow of money so that they can get all of this money that accumulates behind the dam, right? They're trying to like get the flow of it to stop so that they can have this huge investment that they can cash out later, right? Which makes no sense in terms of the way nonprofits work. Now we're not trying to accumulate money. Well, if we're doing it right, we're not trying to accumulate money. So that's not the point of it. The point of a nonprofit in general is to get as much money funneled to our mission operations as possible. So that is two things. That means what we're really trying to do is get money fast and spend it fast so that we can maximize our mission outcomes in some way, right? So it's not about accumulating a bunch of money and just spending a tiny bit of money. which is
Right.
what financial statements are supposed to show you.
Oh.
Like they're talking about, the income statement is all about like, what's your net profit? And for a nonprofit, that's like, well, let's not talk about that because it's not important, because inevitably next year we're going to have a budget and it's going to show a shortfall. And then we're going to have this long conversation about, well, the point of this is not to accumulate money. The point of this is to do mission things, right? Which is deeply confusing for lots of board members.
Absolutely.
So the thing that we're most interested in as nonprofits is not balance sheet, not income statement, not profit, but what's called liquidity, which is how fast can I turn money into mission outcome? What is the speed at which I can take money and turn it into mission outcome without having the river dry up, right? This is where the water wheel analogy comes in, right? Because if the river stops flowing, which is the donors stop giving you money, there's nothing to turn the wheel, right? If you put a dam on the other side, if you stop spending money, it fills up with water and the wheel isn't spinning, right? So you need the water to go really fast past the water wheel to get it to spin. You can't spin it too fast or it'll come apart. I mean, the analogy totally breaks down if you think about it too hard. But in general, you're just trying to get money through as fast as possible. And the measure of that, when we talk about that in sort of a nonprofit financial sense, is called liquidity, which means like how fast can I turn donor interest into mission outcomes? Like what do I do to do that? And the way we represent that in financial statements is interesting, which is what the question is asking about. So when you think about that sort of raising money and spending money, one of the things that you don't want to do, so you think about what the bad outcomes are, right? The bad outcomes are you spend the money too fast and then the wheel stops turning because there's nothing in the riverbed, right? You've choked it off because you spun it out too fast and all the money went away. So you need to make sure that you've got some money banked away so that the wheel keeps turning at the right speed. And that's what the liquidity statement, or figuring out a way to calculate liquidity in a way that makes sense to a nonprofit, gets complicated. So if we talk about a pledge, like in a financial statement, a pledge shows up as revenue. But we know a pledge is a pledge. It's not money yet. It's just imaginary money that somebody may give us later, that we hope they'll give us money, but they've promised to give us money, but we don't actually have it. So we can't really spend a pledge. We need that pledge to be turned into cash. So calculating liquidity is this sort of concept of figuring out what goes on the top side of the equation. Like, do we calculate pledge payments instead of pledges? One of the things the question asks is, do we worry about restrictions? So if a donor says, here's some money, you can only spend this on a building, like how does that change the equation of like doing our mission? Like, is acquiring the building the same as doing our mission, or is that something that we need to keep separate and calculate that separately? To sort of answer the question after the 20-minute preamble.
Hey, I just want to say thank you for that, and I really appreciate any analogies when it comes to finance. So fellow listeners, I hope you feel the same.
Yeah. And seriously, I mean, follow up with more questions, because this is something that I think this is like one of the key things that I'm really interested in is making sure people understand that regular financial statements are nonsense and that we need to be looking at something new. So the way I usually generate something like this is to start with the budget. So when we create a budget and the money we know what we expect to spend, and it's based on the strategic plan, right? We always base our budgets on the strategic plan. So we know what our intended mission outcomes are. We know what revenue is going to come in because the development team has given us really good information about where they're raising money and when it's coming in. And then we know when the money is going out as well. So instead of saying we're going to spend money on we're going to spend $10,000 on the electric bill this year, right? Instead of saying that, you're going to say, I'm going to spend $856 per month. And then it gets higher in the summer because we have the air conditioner on. It's like $1,200 a month in the summer, and then back to $800. No, maybe it's down to $500 in the winter, right? So you actually figure out a monthly sort of flow of how that money goes through the organization with as granular as you can get. Yeah. So there's a point of where law of diminishing returns, right? At some point, the detail is just not important anymore, but you want to get to the level of detail where you can look and say, in any given month, am I going to have enough money? Am I going to have enough money in my bank to be able to pay out my expenses to be able to meet my mission requirements for that month? And it becomes a sort of monthly statement where you say, okay, now I see that in April, and it's never April, it's always like September. In September or August, like we're going to get really close to zero. So what do I need to do to make sure that I don't go below zero in August? Because going below zero on a liquidity, some sort of liquidity calculation, means that you don't have any money. Your bank account is empty and you need to figure out a way to make payroll. Right. So what do I have to slow down or move around at the beginning of the month? For things like restrictions, you just kind of have to look at them one at a time. Like, is it for a building? And is the building, like having the money for a building that I can't spend until I actually build the building? It probably doesn't belong in my liquidity calculation. Is it something that's easily released? Is it like, this is just our normal operations and it doesn't cover everything, but I don't really feel like a lot of it's going to be restricted at the end of our year? Then go ahead and include that in the calculation because you feel like, it's gonna flow through the system without like having a big part left over because we know we're going to spend it. And it really just kind of comes down to your budgeting process at the beginning of the year, taking into consideration not just income and expense, but income and expense and time. And what you started with, you start with how much money you start with. And then, because at the beginning of the year, theoretically, you have money in your bank account. So you don't have to earn it all at once. You can spend down what you already have in your bank account. The benefit is that then you can start sharing this with your board, and then they get way less freaked out about a shortfall for the year. So when you present your budget, you're like, oh, we're down by $100,000, and nobody's going to freak out because they're like, oh, but look, we have $3 million in the bank. So it's okay to be down by $100,000 because then we'll have $2.9 million in the bank at the end of the year, which is still okay. So, helping
I love,
with that
though,
kind of thing
as you're
too.
talking about it, I'm thinking about, is it possible? Is it possible to get away from those traditional financial statements? Is there a reason that nonprofits, because is it just like they've gotten into the pattern where everyone knows these are this is what you do in for profit, so let's mirror it for nonprofit with our own sort of GAAP accounting, principles or whatever? I'm just why are we looking at financials that aren't really showing us the right picture is also a question I have.
Yeah. And part of it is, so they're a little bit different. So nonprofits have a statement of functional expenses that we're required to do, which is to answer the question about overhead, about how much we're spending on program, and it's really, it doesn't give you as an internal user or even as a board member any useful information about the organization. But as an external person who knows nothing, it's a very rough analysis. If you look at an organization, they're spending 80% on fundraising. Okay, maybe I don't want to give to you because it doesn't look like you're actually doing anything, right? So it can catch outliers, but that's about all it does. Every once in a while, FASB makes adjustments to what nonprofits have to report, and it's almost always about something like revenue recognition. About if somebody gives you a pledge, what do I book as revenue? Because they're trying. They're not. It's not like they've just given up on the nonprofit sector. And the other thing is that financial statements, most people can read them. Most people can read an income statement and a balance sheet. Especially if you're a board member, cash flow statement, I'd say maybe 10% of people can read it. But the other two are really clear and people understand them. And because it's kind of that's just the format things are in, that's just how we present it. We're required to do it. It goes in our audited financial statements. They have to do it the same way. So and they just kind of get generated. It's not something I would be super concerned about. What we should work on, sort of as nonprofit professionals, is to come up with things that answer the questions that the board might have. What financial question might the board have? And to say, and some of them are are we going to make it? Are we going to run out of cash? Those are questions the board's concerned about. So those are the kinds of answers that you should be providing in the reports that you provide them, not necessarily just something that we have to give you because we're required by law to give it to you.
Right.
That's not, I don't know. That's compliance is the lowest bar.
Okay. So then back to, I know I sidebarred us with that little caveat, but so when you're looking at the question, so can you talk a little bit about cash equivalent, right? Because it's do we just take cash on hand divided by average monthly expenses, or do we make it more nuanced with cash plus cash equivalent?
Yeah. So what cash equivalent? So the question asks two things. should we use just cash, or should we use there's a section of the balance sheet called cash, and includes things that are cash equivalent, which means that you can convert them to cash relatively quickly. And that would be like if you have money invested in like a mutual fund or something like a publicly traded mutual fund, you could probably get that out in a few days if you had to. I mean, you might lose money on it. It might be a dumb time to not invest it. But that could be considered you might consider that if you're willing to go through and like take a hit on that investment to get the cash. It really depends on how close to the bone you want to play it. It's one of these things that you say, like, if you're not currently working in an organization, like, this is really a simple thing to say, but if you're in it, you're like, yeah, whatever, Andy. But it's like when you're doing your budget, you should probably make sure that you've got a reserve available, that there's money that's just sitting there waiting for when things don't go the way you planned. And you get to determine, along with your board, like how much that money is. It's a hard conversation to have with your board. They get really confused about it. They're like, well, why would I raise money if we're not going to spend it on our mission? And we're like, well, because you don't want us to explode, right?
Yeah.
So, like, we're doing our best, we're coming up with our best estimate with what's going to happen, but it's still effectively made up. It's us guessing. So I'm glad that you trust us and think that we're going to hit the numbers exactly, but we're not going to hit the numbers exactly. Right. It's just not possible. So we need to have some kind of buffer. So you should try to raise money for a buffer and then have that buffer be part of it. And then, invest it. Put it in a money market fund or something where it feels like it's out of the way. The board can feel like it's out of the way and not something you're just going to like, oh, I need a new chair for my back, so I dipped into the fund to buy one or some other nonsense like that. The other thing that's in the question that I didn't really answer is like, it says average monthly expenses. I wouldn't, if you're going to the level of detail of asking people when they're going to spend the things they say they're going to spend, you shouldn't have to average anything, right? You should be able to know, like, so it says, I'm going to need, and this is part of the budgeting process too. When somebody, in a bigger organization, somebody's like, I need $10,000 for printing. And you get to go back as the finance person, you get to go back and say, for what? Like, tell me where $10,000 comes from, right? And they're going to go, well, that's it's $1 a sheet, so it's 10,000 sheets. And you're like, of what? 10,000 sheets of what? Like, you have to tell me what you're going to spend it on. I'm not going to tell you no if you're honest about what you're asking for. And it's especially when you have people that have come from the for-profit world and then ended up in nonprofits, or have worked in nonprofits that are managed really weirdly, where like if you have money left over in your budget at the end of the year, like, you get dinged the next year. Like, we're going to say whatever you spent last year, that's what you get, like minus 2% or something like that. Some like made up thing.
Yeah.
And then so they're like, well, if I don't spend it all by the end of the year, I'm not going to get it next year. And then we might potentially be in a bind, right? First of all, it's a really stupid way to budget. Like, what you want to do is say, here's your strategic plan. And these are the goals for you and your team in the strategic plan. Tell me what you need to reach those goals, right? And tell me honestly, what do you exactly need to reach those goals? And if we can't raise the money to spend that, we will come back to you and say, okay, we can't raise that much. Tell us how you're going to adjust your goals so that you can lower the amount of money that you're required to spend on it. So, we need to move it all together. We don't just say, well, tough baloney, you get half of what you asked for and you still have to do all of the goals that you said you were going to do, because then it just makes people mad, right? So you get to adjust the goals along with revenue and things like that. So it's part of a bigger, sort of more robust, more, I don't want to say holistic, but like super detailed, thoughtful budget process, and not like, the fire drill that we see a lot, where it's just like, oh, the budget needs to be done on Thursday because the board has to approve it on Friday. Run, right? Pull me information from the accounting system. Like, no, you needed to start like 2 months ago.
Yes.
It's too late. It's too late to do it right. So let's do it right next year.
That's why it's a process, right? That's why when you hear people say we are beginning our budgeting process, it's not a one afternoon kind of event. So if it's done properly.
And I'm sure, my like employees that have worked with me in the past where I was responsible for budget have like horror stories of the first time they heard about what the process was going to be like. Because we're like, well, the budget's not due until June 12th. Why are we starting in January? Like, trust me, you want to start in January. I'm going to do a lot of the work for you. I'm going to do tons of the work for you. I'm going to make it really easy for you. But because of that, we're starting in January. So,
So then excluding revenue, I know that like the question talked about, right? Like what about excluding revenue with donor restrictions and unrestricted, property
Yeah, I
and
think
equipment?
you can't just so you can't just look at the balance sheet and go, I'm going to pick these 5 lines from the balance sheet and that's going to be what my cash position is. You have to like think about each of the things. Like, okay, I've got stuff that's restricted. How is it restricted? I've got stuff that's a fixed asset. Like, am I seriously going to sell this fixed asset if I needed to come up with cash? I mean, maybe you will. Maybe it's a truck that you've been trying to get rid of. But I think you have to like think long and hard about that whole process. And you can't just yank it directly out of the accounting system. It's let's look at every single line and figure out where this is going to go and then document it so next year it doesn't suck quite as much.
And this is why organizations have finance people or bring in people like you to go through that level of detail, right? I mean, in your past,
somebody's got to do it.
Yeah. I mean, oh my goodness. Oh, yes.
So, and here's the thing, like, so I work with, we never want to turn the conversation about consulting, right? But I work with lots of organizations and many of them struggle very much with budgeting. And it's because no one ever showed them how to do it. They just they walked in, like they didn't have that expertise. There wasn't somebody like me who would be like, what would be cool is if we totally redesigned this whole thing to make it not suck, right? They just came in and like, we have to get it done. It's sort of unnecessarily evil. This is how we did it last year. Let's try that again, right? And they come out and they're inaccurate and they're not very useful and people feel like it's foisted on them, I worked before, like for a while, I was working for a government agency. And it was the worst kind of budgeting, right? Where we did the work and we said, this is what we need. And they're like, suck it, you get half, right? And we're like, okay. So, but all of our outcomes are going to be new. And they're like, no, they can't be new. You get half, right? And so it's like, and everybody just was immediately deflated and hated everybody else. It was like, how is that fair? How do you get to tell me? Like, you have no idea what we're doing here. How do you get to decide how much money it's going to take for me to reach my goals? Like, if it's not available, great. Let's talk about how the goals are going to change. But you can't just like arbitrarily slash it, which is why, one of the reasons that, I think I like to be much more, talking to everybody and getting feedback and making sure everybody's totally cool with how the process is going to work and making it so that it's not like, well, I'm your dad and this is how it is, right? It's like, never want to do that.
I like that you mentioned the budgeting thing, though. I feel like that's another example of one of those times where we see employees when they start to elevate and get promoted in organizations, and just like they're oftentimes not given management training on how to be a good manager, they're also not given training on how to develop a budget properly for the organization or for their department. Like, how many times do you see people struggling with it? And then they're like, what? Oh my gosh, I wanted to go to this conference this year. Well, you didn't put it in the budget. I mean, golly.
Yeah. There's always, that's one of those things that people would come like with their hat in their hand, come into the office and be like, we didn't spend money on this thing, but we want to spend it on that thing. Is that okay? Do I need to do like a budget amendment or anything like that? And it's like, no, that's fine. I trust you.
Yeah.
Like I don't need to approve that. Just do it. Yeah. So, people that have been burned from like the super autocratic jerk budget people from in the past. Thanks for listening to another episode of Nonprofit Everything. Stacey and I are very thankful that you've spent a half an hour with us listening to us babble about complicated nonprofit topics, which is what we love to do. Send us questions, nonprofiteverything.com. It's also where you'll find show notes. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks.